bottle. You ready? There is the general flow of life, which is another statement of the fact that life is alive, and there is the flow through each man, which he takes to be his personally, but which is simply one small part of the general flow. The general flow surrounds and runs through everything, impersonally. But in men's minds, the flow is taken to be their individual state of consciousness. It is a commonly accepted fact among men that they act in ways that are stupid and not in the self-interest of creatures claiming to be intelligent. And to explain this, they look far and wide, to the heavens for supernatural influences, and to subterranean levels for forgotten mundane causes. Yet they never cast their eyes to questioning their concept of just what is intelligence. Once free of the constraints of local gravity, the definition of intelligence becomes that which works, which is understandably inadequate to the minds of beings still under construction. Poet's Corner. You can have too much salt, you can have too much rain, you can have too much except of one particular thing. Attention. Anonymous, of course. The general flow cannot be stopped, altered, or diverted in any way. Only that part of it running through man's mind is subject to any control. Human emotions do not presently have as specific an individual purpose as do physical survival instincts from which they arise. At the collective level, they serve as man's civilizing influence. But on the individual level, a man must create his own personal use. At the mental level, the general flow of life is what men take to be their individual consciousness. But the fact is that you must create your own individual flow to be conscious, for it does not naturally come to man. It is rumored there was once a person involved in this sort of activity who reached a personal place whereat they began to think of the two possible states of consciousness available to man as simply being conscious and being stupid. Wonder why it never became popular. The general flow being universal and an ordinary man's mind not, he must bring it down to his level of comprehension by the process of first fragmentation, followed by frustrating attempts at reconstruction. Yeah. To see the general flow in its universality requires that a man separate in some way his own awareness therefrom. The water cannot be perceived while you are drowning. A man once found himself in a beautiful new location, but when back home could not think how he had gotten there. So he did the one thing possible. He thought about the new location all the time, or as much as he could. One man discovered himself a hint. The body can be annoyed without saying anything, but the emotions cannot. And without the body there are no emotions. So, he said to himself, so, he repeated again, so, well, what do you suppose we can do with this? Yeah. The general flow is so busy that a mindful man can get no clear picture of what is occurring therein if his sight is confined to eyes indebted to the flow. A man with a clear comprehension of what a more productive state of awareness is after that no longer troubled with the so-called vanity problem. Once understanding is loosed from the restraints of collective thought, the words vanity and stupidity are seen as synonymous. It is said there was once also another man engaged in this kind of effort who began to think of the two conditions of consciousness possible as being here and not being here. The general flow is so noisy that a mindful man can hear nothing of value therein if he listens with ears that are products of the flow. One father's advice to a child Never say that you are not a fool, lest by doing so you become one. In a faraway kingdom, the people accepted the fact that all advice that concerned talk was redundant and thus irrelevant. One man so pondered, "It is obviously natural for the body and survival instincts to be mechanical and habitual, and beneficial that they be so. But how about thought? Why does it also appear like this? And to what profit?" The general flow is so nonspecific that a mindful man can extract no exact lessons therefrom, if his investigatory techniques have been learned from the flow. A man once found himself in a beautiful new location, but when back home could not recall how he had gotten there exactly. But one thing he could remember was that just before arriving there, he had been exposed to what he normally considered to be an extremely unpleasant emotional situation. There are two critical comments applicable to those who fight the general flow: that they are both normal, sound, and reasonable people, and also fools. Mindful men devote their attention to the one place profitable, their own consciousness, where through the general flow reveals itself in the only form where change is possible. "I cannot stop the rain," noted one man, "but I have discovered non-porous clothing." And what more can you ask for in an unsettled times such as these, which are always the times? The mind wants to hear elaborate models and theories of life endlessly described, while the actual experience of consciousness is simple, direct, and always at hand. The desires of the mind are not in error, simply of another order. If your intellectual life is limited to the general flow, then you have no choice but to be dumb, or uninformed if you prefer. Chemical update. It's difficult to control your attention while you are writing about controlling your attention. And one man said, "I don't want to think about it, especially while I'm trying to think about it." Historical note: before men conceived of the idea of a God, they paid their respects to one known as, "Geez, give me a break." The mind alone can dream of faraway places. The mind in so doing keeps many from travel and apart from consciousness. From the earth grew flowers, flowers with the strength and cunning to successfully defend themselves. And from these flowers grew other flowers, but ones whose existence was totally dependent on the strength and cunning of the original blooms. Apparatuses without adequate memory are limited in their study of themselves. One man said, "Emotions bring out the best in people." Then someone else countered, "Emotions bring out the worst in people," which was followed by a third man's comment that emotions bring out the people in people, and closed the subject. I hate to do it, but danger alert. One danger for the few is that they can find plain old thinking to be so much fun that they can let it become confused with a better state of awareness. No great harm done other than a hobby taking time away from one's work. As a great mystic once allegedly said, "If sex gave me as much pleasure consistently as can my mind at times, I'd have been between the sheets so much I'd never had the time to be a mystic." The same, of course, can be said regarding any of man's survival instincts vis-a-vis his intellectual interests. The bad news: the general flow through man is unstoppable. The good news: it's almost unstoppable. There was once a race of creatures who defined the possible as being the proper combination of knowledge and effort. One man had office hours. He was only in for 4 or 5 minutes a day. And oh, how he hated that. The growing season. In one sense, ordinary emotions can only live in the dark, that is to say, in areas not beheld by conscious attention. If life would respond to questions, and you ask it whether it was totally mechanical or not, it would be the only instance in the life of man wherein the answers of yes and no would both be correct and not mutually exclusive. When you realize how this can be, your understanding of human intelligence has exploded. Quiz time. How would a man walk in a rut? To conserve energy? Why would a man feel and think in a rut? Same answer, I guess. Thank you, contestants. 'Tis further alleged that someone who had undertaken the struggle came to a position of picturing the two alternative states of awareness as being somebody and not really existing. A large part of what keeps ordinary men's minds going is their belief that it is they who are keeping their minds going. Without controlled focused attention, your flow of consciousness and the general flow of life are one and the same. Subject closed. One man had office hours, and his sight seemed to be tied to his presence, for when he wasn't in, he couldn't see. The body needs no words, only the mind. And once it has them, it soon demands modifiers. Being alive at the ordinary level is like being in a poker game in which the stakes are meaningless, but for the game to continue, they must be endlessly raised. One man had office hours, and his intelligence seemed to be connected to his presence, for when he wasn't in, he was stupid as hell. One reason it is so hard to see is that life creates man, and man creates life, though on different scales. Models and theories are always at a distance from that which they attempt to represent, and no amount of belief therein will ever bring them closer. There was once a world in which the creatures conceived of experience as being totally different, totally dependent on the instant moment. A man's natural awareness of life is life's natural awareness of man. Anything beyond that is the responsibility of an individual person. Life in tall buildings. The people downstairs are always home. Those upstairs, however, are another merely, entirely also. Life in the mystical lane. The few want one thing and one thing only: to be home all the time, throughout the building. Irritated eyes never see. The connection between anger and visual ability is seldom noticed. One man adopted this approach. He would only speak directly to life, never to any individual circumstances. Movement re-examined. If you're not here, you can't go anywhere. Real work on consciousness only begins when consciousness sees nowhere else to go. To survive, the body is forever seeking. To survive, the mind is forever seeking. To grow, consciousness is still. Time re-examined. When is when? When is always now, always and forever now. When consciousness begins to see, it points toward where nothing exists. I have been making private threats to come up with a new description of what emotions are in the life of man. But you can always use what is commonly conceived as being reality and go from there. And I have the impression that enough people have your own understanding and individual view of what emotions amount to in the life of man. Perhaps I will give a new description, because then it's possible to give a better one, but let's go ahead with what seems to be man's emotions and consider my old drawing of the human nervous system. Again, And the emotions seem to be somewhere in the mid-range, if we're going to look at this, even though it is non-sequential and it is really non-spatial and it is all overlapping, but to look at this being the body with all of its physical, instinctive, or physical survival instincts, and then up to the high end, that being man's brain and the thought processes, and emotions seem to be somewhere either in Never Never Land, or the easiest to describe after seeing up those two extremes is to say the emotions are somewhere floating around in between. Consider first, again, with a slightly different twist, that the body, if we look at it for the sake of, the temporary sake of this discussion, if you look at on the body as though it could be profitably spoken of as a separate entity from everything else, then there are pleasures of the body requiring no thought, no word. In fact, you can interfere with the pleasures of the body by talking about it too much, which is what some people, ordinary people, sometimes suspect about talking too much about sex. Probably a little less specific, but there surely are some people that would sit down to eat, perhaps at a big banquet, and whoever's in charge of the banquet, the host, stands there with his carving knife or with his wine glass, and everyone's prepared to eat, and he goes into a long, elaborate discussion of what the meals consist of and where it came from and the background of certain dishes, to the point that some people sitting there hungry would think, boy, I wish he would shut up so we could eat. The pleasures of the body are without question, however, the sensations, a full stomach, sex, nice rest, a nap when you're tired, and conversely, the joy of exercise that some people do experience, the joy of movement. And in a similar fashion, the mind undoubtedly can experience certain pleasures. The way the population is distributed, the way the activity is distributed, there are far less people who enjoy anything that could be described as pleasures of the mind than there are pleasures of the body, because almost everyone enjoys the pleasures of the body. Pleasures of the mind, you could see it quite simply as any intellectual challenge, the figuring out of problems, the conjuring up of new theories. Where are the joys of emotions? Ordinary people would want to say that there are obviously or easily describable emotional joys, but what would they describe? If you said, well, give me an example, describe it to me, they would start describing what would not be unfairly, or what not unfairly I could point out, are simply the passions of the body. And if you pushed it and you made them realize what you were pointing toward, where would they go with it? They would attempt then to get into, if they were sharp-witted, even at the ordinary level, they would attempt to get into areas that would apparently have no relationship vis-a-vis human emotions to anything that could be simply described or dismissed as passions of the body. They would very likely try to get into charity, sympathy, concern, and love as some way opposed or is separated from sex, or not limited to sex. The fact is, if you can see it all, and it's not to dismiss emotions, it's trying to get another view of it, all of those things, from charity to love to sympathy, concern for your fellow man, all of them can be seen displaying themselves at a much more direct level, sans any speech, sans any mental imagination, in animals. You can see it in man on the basis of it being the kinds of physical reactions that go on between any pack animals. If someone understands this, what I'm pointing to, and I ask them point blank if they went that far and they said, yeah, I can see. Well, let me put it to you this way. From one view, emotions are simply outgrowths of survival instinct. And if you can see it that way, without it being what you consider it to be any criticism of so-called human emotions, but you see it as being simply a second order survival instincts. They do not spring from nowhere. That everything, even those considered to be uniquely human, you can see them as being. All you've got to do is just open your brain a little bit, your mind a little bit, and you can move backwards, move back down the nervous system, move back down the evolution of man, individually and collectively, and see such things as charity, sympathy, love. You can see them as being a kind of second order, one step removed from quite straightforward passions of a survival nature. If anyone can see that, then you're left with a question that really has no immediate answer. That is, then what are joys of emotions? What are joys that men get from emotions that you cannot directly trace to another source? Can you point out any joy that a person has in the so-called emotions that in some way cannot be seen, but any effort at all cannot be seen as simply another description of the passions of the body, that cannot be seen as originally passions of the body, physical sensations, for the one simple reason to keep the organism physically alive? Without trying to prove it, you can either try and see it on your own or not, but you can ask yourself this, using you generically, that if someone did insist, well, that can't be true, man does have something unique about him besides just his ability to speak and have abstract thoughts, that his emotions single him out. They are emblematic of his unique position. Okay, if that be true, then you go ahead, I'm saying rhetorically, you go ahead and you picture whatever emotions that you see exist, emotion or emotions, that are not simply a second order, a second generation, an outgrowth or survival instincts. Go ahead and think about them. You don't have to tell me, but go ahead and think of one or two, whatever you have in mind. And now tell me this, using those or any others you want to, but by your own definition, what you call human emotions. Take your time, ponder it, reflect on it a second, and tell me of what pleasure have they given you in life. Now, I'm using pleasure in just a straightforward sense in the same way I started out, that the body unquestionably gives people pleasure. You enjoy a good meal. You enjoy sleep. What human emotions give joy, give pleasure in any way comparable to that? And if we took, I'll go ahead and do some of it, but you should do it yourself. If we took the ones that would be most commonly said to be uniquely human and not simply offshoots, outgrowths of survival instincts, such as charity, sympathy, do they give pleasure at the ordinary level? When I say pleasure, let's look at it this way, not bittersweet pleasure. The body does not have bittersweet pleasure. Well, not if you're sane. The closest to bittersweet pleasure, I guess, would be someone who's a little out of whack, that you eat good food like good chocolate ice cream and other nourishing good food, and it's so good, it's pleasurable, and then you eat too much. But that is not being a sane person. The point is, if you operate in a sane manner, in a reasonable survival manner, which overeating is not conducive to survival, but simply eating an adequate amount, getting enough sleep is not bittersweet. There's no ambivalence involved. A person does not get through a good sex. You go, and then go, wait a minute. Well, I don't know. Or to have a good meal and go, oh, God, I love chocolate ice cream. I've always loved it. Well, I don't know, except for, there just is no such thing. That is to try and ease up on the fact that someone can say that, contrary to what I stated, that there are emotions that are absolutely removed from and separate from survival instincts. And let us say that they use sympathy. It does not offer pleasure. Now, at first, people might support the notion. They might say, no, it is pleasurable. It is pleasurable. It gives you a warm feeling. There is pleasure involved in being sympathetic to the plight of another. Because the only reason that you ever feel sympathy is for somebody who has had a piece of bad luck. They have experienced something that was non-pleasurable. And for you to have sympathy for it, you must take into account, you must hear about, see it, and then think about their displeasurable experience. Your offering of sympathy, no matter that it starts off and can sound as though, and of course in the civilized world they make it sound not just as though it is reasonable and human, they attempt to raise it to damn transcendental levels, that being sympathetic is a godly emotion. It's not just a uniquely human emotion, it is perhaps the highest emotion that you can look around at your fellow man, look around at your neighbor, and your neighbor's son just died. A horrible experience. And you can look about it, talk about it, listen to them whine and moan and go, I feel sympathy. Something that no animal can do. No animal can learn of the death of another animal. No lion can hear of a fellow lion's loss of its cub. They can't hear about it, be told about it. Lions do not then go off and sit under a tree and think, one of my favorite people had their child die, their cub die. They don't do that. Only humans can, God forbid I should put it this way, they might say, but have the pleasure, the admirable emotional feel of sympathetic reactions to the plight of others. In no sense keep dancing around the campfire. Again, you either see it or you don't. To call, and I'm using pleasurable in the widest sense, but to call having sympathy. And remember, you only have sympathy when there's some cause to have sympathy. You don't have sympathy when your neighbor won the lottery. Then we're into greed and conspiracy to murder, perhaps. You only have sympathy when something bad has occurred. And for you to have sympathy, you have to be aware of it. And it has to strike you as bad. It has to be ill fortune. And to have sympathy requires that you be able to think. So you must think about that, whatever it was, the death of someone. You must think about that. And then ordinary people will insist, though, but there is something good about being able to feel sympathetic because, well, it's just good. They would be insisting, if they were following this, that in the sense I was using it, when I said that the body has undeniable pleasures and that the mind can also experience pleasure. And then my inference being, if you don't see what it is that emotions, which I am not even granting exist as they say they are, but to take the manifestation that ordinary people say, call emotions, my question was, rhetorically, what pleasure do they give? I was already inferring, which I assume you rhetorically picked up, that it's questionable whether so-called emotions actually give pleasure. But taking the line that I set up, if an ordinary person was following this, they would say that sympathy, to fit my general definition, is pleasurable. Not that they're going to smile and dance around when they hear that their neighbor has had ill fortune, but they swear, ordinary people, they say, well, it makes me feel good to be able to be sympathetic. You know this. You know that people get together. It's easy to make fun of it. There's no cause for sarcasm. But you know, everybody has family members, some distant aunt or somebody or a handful of them, that at the least sign of trouble in the family, somebody's sick, if they're close to death, there's always several people that will rush there. Oftentimes it seems to be their hobby that they may not have a family, but they rush there. They're just drawn immediately to calamities. And they're just delighted to be there. They'll call up and say, I'm on the way, can you pick me up at the airport? I heard that, your husband may be dying. Well, there's no need for you to come. Oh, I'll be there now. I've already bought my ticket. And you think, we ain't even sure he's dying. Oh, well, he could be. I want to be there just in case. I know you need my help at a crucial time like this. And on a simpler level is watching soap operas, reading, listening to the news, listening to anything that is bad news is what it amounts to. In the human nervous system, ordinary people are wired up to be attuned to it. And it does no good to tell ordinary people that they enjoy suffering because they'll deny it. And you'll say, well, why do you go to funerals? Why do you always trump the news when it comes on about a tragedy, a bus wreck? A school bus has been hit by a boulder, a ferry full of men and women, and little children. It's sunk in a hurricane, and 600 people die. Why do you always trump the news? Why do you read about such as that? And their story is, and again, I'm not making a criticism, I'm simply pointing out the way it is. Their criticism, or their response is that they are humans, and reading such as that, they feel sympathetic. They almost take it into a transcendental or a mystical level that what they're saying in essence is by them reading, by them listening intently to the descriptions of this tragedy that overtook a group of helpless people, it's the inference. The tacit inference is that they are contributing to the well-being of humanity, if not the deceased or those suffering, by you, thousands of miles away, reading, hearing about it, trump the news, and going, oh. Now, collectively, that is a part of being civilized. There is nothing unusual about that, but that is still on the level of the kinds of physical sensations that take place without words, without imagination, without an intellect, between all pack animals. That same sort of thing. That is the basis of it. And yet humans will say, perhaps, that sympathy would be the outstanding example of a human emotion that is not survival-based. Because they can say, well, it doesn't serve any purpose. It is just something that is uniquely human. It is part of the divine spark or whatever description they want to give. But can you see that there is no such thing, any human emotion you want to pick out? How about love? I thought sympathy might be easier to see, but what ordinary people call love, not sex, but what people say is love. We all know there's no such thing as love. There's bittersweet love. There's no such thing as love without heartbreak. If love was love by itself, do you realize that the city of Nashville would still be involved with small-time steel mills? There'd be no country music. Half of Shakespeare's plays would have gone unwrit. There's no drama without complaining. There is simply no such thing. Let me try it another way. If we call it two different things, if we call it, describe physical passion, physical sensation, let's call it, and then emotion. And for just a second, let's say they're two different things. Physical sensation is the joy of a good meal, of sex, of a good night's sleep when you're tired. It is not bittersweet. Everyone knows what bittersweet means. It means that it's sort of fun, and yet there's some kind of hovering, lingering, subterranean, threatening, always nascent counteraction to this. That for every piece of good emotion, for every experience of good emotion is with it. Whether it leaps at your throat immediately or not, but is always the lurking possibility of this pleasurable emotion turning unpleasurable. That all love affairs generally turn into something else. All sympathy, if it's carried far enough, will turn into something else. All of it will turn into, in case you'd never thought about it, all you got to do is be sympathetic to somebody and try to keep it up consistently. And whether it comes out overtly at another person, you can sit there and do it in the privacy of your own head from watching TV or reading the news. But sympathy carried consistently far enough will turn into hostility. Just as most love, not to pick on love, not to pick on country music, but almost all love, everybody's had enough experience, almost every love affair sooner or later turns into some kind of hostility. You cannot depend on human emotion, back to comparing my two arbitrary distinctions, you cannot depend on the consistent nature of apparent so-called positive human emotion in the same way that you can physical sensation. People do not turn on a good meal. somewhere along the line as a child you took up eating. And again, some of you are saying we're not talking about pathological states of so-called eating disorders and all that crap. We're talking about ordinary people. At a very early age, you take up eating. And life in its wisdom has arranged that those things that are necessary for survival are pleasurable. What's more fun than eating and screwing and sleeping? That's it. So let's take eating. You picked up eating at an early age, but it was not bittersweet. There is no possibility, again discounting some so-called pathological disorder, somewhere along the line, after you've been eating, say for 10 years, it's not like, or let's say 7 years, the old classic thing about the 7-year itch in marriages that people are madly in love, and about every 7 years, people fall out of love. Marriages fall apart. The statistics have proved that for thousands of years. But at any rate, you take up eating, and there is no 7-year itch in eating. After you were eating at the age of, most people started eating what? I'm just guessing, 2 or 3 days, maybe a week old. By the age of 7, you did not turn on eating. Eating did not prove to be a bittersweet pleasure. Somewhere in your life, eating did not become displeasurable. You follow. Sex does not become displeasurable. Sleep in bed does not become displeasurable. It is simply pleasurable, and there's nothing else to say. There is no counterpart to it. There is no negative reaction to it. It is not bittersweet. All human emotions, on the other hand, are bittersweet. They will all turn into, given enough time, and it doesn't take any sort of catastrophic or occurrence for them to turn into damn near their opposite. And if their opposite sounds too abstract, almost all so-called human emotion, all human emotion that you can describe as being positive, if they're carried far enough, will turn into aggression. So I don't leave it abstract. Don't just worry about their opposite and think what the opposite of charitable is. If you're charitable long enough, under the same conditions, the same person, you'll become hostile toward the person. If you're in the throes of what you call love, and it goes on far enough under the same kind of conditions under which you started, it will turn into a feeling of hostility. Charity, all you got to do is be charitable to somebody long enough, and you'll get hostile toward them. It just does. That is what I mean by bittersweet. It is not pleasurable per se. It can be pleasurable under certain circumstances. It can be pleasurable to start with, but you cannot say that it is pleasurable without conditions. And even that's being charitable, because I'm telling you, you can see it in your own life. To say pleasurable without conditions makes it sound as though that there's a distinct possibility it can become unpleasurable. I just point out, and you've got your own life to gauge it by, and everyone else's that you've observed, it is not a question of it maybe, of it might, it's a matter of when. And those that do not turn into aggression, then whatever the situation, if it was charity, love, whatever it was, the particular situation that we might speak of as an example, if it does not turn into aggression, it simply means that it didn't go far enough. It was just a passing fancy. It was a momentary emotion. The question I was asking you is then to ponder yourself, what pleasure, what good have human emotions done me? If you are sane, if you have any ability to see, you're left with a very doubtful response. What can you say? I would suggest to you, if you look at the immediate answers that come to mind, they can still be seen as no more than new names, fancy names, misdirected names for survival instincts. Anyone, now this certainly does not apply to ordinary people. It's not supposed to, they'd never see it, but I'm just going ahead and point out to you. I'll answer it for you and do it the easy way, and then you can go back and check your own experience and your own observation and find out if you'll correct me. I'm just going ahead and tell you that with anything resembling objective sight, objective survey, an objective survey of your life, your experience, and everything you've observed, you cannot say that those emotions that are always referred to by ordinary people, just taking their description, and you've always accepted it, to take what they refer to as human emotion not physical passion, not physical sensation, but human emotion, I would say that they have not benefited you. The ones, if you take the ones that are identified like charity, love, and etc., they have not benefited you whatsoever. They have contributed nothing to your existence. We can all take a second. It's not hard to see. After that, it's sort of hard what to make of it. It's one of those things that when you first see it, it's sort of like you turned a corner and you ran to somebody that you didn't expect to see. Like walking in your office and your mother's there and she's never been there before, and it's like the whole situation is sort of out of kilter. And it takes a while to orient yourself. You feel like, well, I walked into some sort of dream, or this is a fantasy. Because there you are faced with an absolute fact, a reality, let's say, that you realize that put in that context, so-called human emotions have done me no good. Now forget doing you harm, but they have done you no good. If I had never felt sympathy, now remember, you can't just say felt sympathy. It is the full dynamic of what sympathy leads to. This doesn't mean the momentary of suddenly you heard that your mother died, or a friend's mother died, a close friend of yours. There is a feeling of loss as soon as you hear about it, but that is still at the survival level. That is still the sorts of thing that can be traced to the non-genetic kinship indigenous in herd creatures. But it still does not mean that you would not feel sympathetic when you saw one of your close friends and you could just tell that he or she was heartbroken. You said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "My mother died." It does not mean that you would not feel sympathy. But what I'm saying is that emotion carried on, not as a momentary sensation, but that human emotion, in this case sympathy, is something. It is a dynamic. It is a continuing reality that should be a part and parcel of any civilized man and woman's life. Ask yourself, has sympathy, not an example of sympathy, not the example I just made of your best friend's mother dying, but has sympathy, is having sympathy for other people, has it been of any benefit whatsoever to me? And the answer is no, unless you're ordinary. It has contributed nothing to your life. I won't go any further. They get stickier if I said that same thing about love. Not that I should be that concerned about you people. It's not going to hurt you. It gets a little harder to see, but it doesn't once you realize that love is simply an outgrowth of sex. But it seems a little harder because if you say outright to somebody, well, love has never done you any good, the human emotion love, then immediately people think of examples, well, that's not true. And you think of all the people you've loved before, all the men or women that you've been in love with. And you think back fondly, people you hadn't seen or thought about in 10 or 20 years. And you go, she was a great, God, I wonder what happened to her. It doesn't mean that you do not feel that and that there's any basis, but that is the same sort of example as when I said that sympathy is one thing when it's a momentary specific of some experience in your life, such as that sympathy is one thing if you heard your best friend's mother died and the sympathy you felt then, and then sympathy as an ongoing dynamic in your life. In the same way, you can think of examples where if I say, well, love's never done you any good, the so-called human emotional love, you think of examples that love was the greatest thing going on, that was the most fun I had. I can remember all the times, the many times I've been seriously in love in my life, or as many as I can remember. I think back, and every damn one of them, after the fact, my little heart just glows, and I think, you think of so-and-so, and then so-and-so, and then when I lived so-and-so, and you say, that was the best times of my life when you fall in love. You can think of the examples, and that doesn't mean that's not true. But I'm saying, the dynamic over your whole lifetime, you and everyone else, but let's take you, that's what you've got to deal with, has the so-called emotion of love really done anything to your life once you realize that love, not specific examples, but that love is no more than another name for sex. If you're going to change the name of it and insist that it is not the same thing as survival instinct, but it's just love, and it's not an absolute outgrowth, it's not just another name for sex, and then you ask yourself, has love contributed anything to my life? Sex has. And you can think of examples where love was very pleasurable. Specific examples at specific times. But you're not in love with the person you were, the people you're dreaming of. It all turns into something else. And as I said, carried far enough, they will all turn into, also called human emotions, will finally revert to. I said turn into, what it amounts to is revert to aggression. I sense that somebody might hear something. It's like this. All human emotions, charity, sympathy, love, here's what happens. It's like a lion's laying there. Let's say full stomach, he had a good meal, he's rested, and you come up, and he's not hungry, and you're sort of irrelevant to him, and you come up to him and you kind of punch him, and he sits there, and you kind of tug at his ear, and he just sits there, and you hit his whiskers and make him go, and he still just sits there, and then you pull his tail. You keep fucking around with him long enough, he's going to turn on you. Count on it. Even if he's not hungry, and he's got no business that you're not even, humans are not even high on his menu. But he is not hungry. He is not going to eat you, but you can count on it. If you stand there and screw around with him long enough, he's going to turn around and do that. You know that. A cat will, a dog will. Well, unless you're the leader of the dog's pack. That is a fair representation, if you can hear it, of me describing that all emotions, the so-called human emotions, will eventually turn on you. If they're carried far enough, it is like screwing around with a line. Something that has no interest, because that's what emotions amount to. People call them one thing, but they in a sense do not exist, and even in the sense that they do exist under another name, they have no interest in you individually in the same way that poets rhapsodize that they do. People write great poems about love, for instance, and charity, as though love and charity were things out there in the world. That love was something that, and of course, people have tried to turn them, to personify them, Cupid. But they treat love and charity and human emotions as though they are things, that they actually exist and they're out there external to man. If they are, in the sense they're believed, then notice they will eventually, if you keep dealing with them on the basis that they're out there, they are like a lion that up to a certain point is indifferent to you. But you keep fooling with it. You keep fooling with being charitable to somebody, and they'll eventually turn on you. You will, instead of having a charitable situation between you and this person, you will have an aggressive situation. You will have a hostile situation between the two. The question back to taking human emotions as they are called, what good have they ever done you? And the answer is none. And it's not that they've done you harm. Let's disregard that. That's not what I'm saying. But to say, what good have they done you? Here's what it amounts to. Not for ordinary people, because ordinary people, they do good. Emotions have done good. The primary purpose that emotions are serving right now is as man's collective civilizing influence. But emotions, as they're called, let's assume that there is somewhere in the nervous system that we can find somewhere where they sprout. That was what was inherent in one of the news stories tonight, that on one planet, from the earth grew flowers. And the flowers had the strength and cunning to successfully defend themselves. And from those flowers grew other flowers. But these flowers were dependent on the strength and cunning for their survival of the original blooms. That is somewhat of the position. What I had in mind was human emotions. That they appear to be there, they appear to be their own flower, but they grew out of another flower. Human emotions, compared to survival instincts, have no comparable, specific, individual purpose. Collectively, it's easy to see that survival instincts keep the race of man going. Individually, your survival instincts, it is obvious enough, keep you going. It's what makes you eat, what make you go to the doctor if you're sick, what would make you probably fight back if someone attacked you. When you look at emotions, now I've already granted the easiest way to describe it and be done with it for the time being. The closest, the most valid description to give to human emotions is at the collective level. The human emotions are serving as the civilizing influence on humanity as a whole. Individually, emotions do not have as specific a purpose at the individual level as your survival instincts do. Which is why I just got through saying another way that the truth is those emotions referred to as humans, if you look at it a certain way, they have served you profitably not one whit. I repeat, don't look at it as, well, yeah, they've harmed me. No, they hadn't harmed you. We're not talking about, well, love broke my heart. Or sympathy. I'm always so sympathetic to other people, it just keeps me all upset and bothered. It's not that they are doing you harm. You must first see that contrary to what everyone says, they have contributed nothing. There is no specific use at the present, individually, for emotions. Contrary to the fact that everyone says they do. The collective of humanity says they do. Books are full of poems, novels, literature, the arts. That is one of the, if you never thought about it, that is one of the reasons for the appearance of art. That is, at the mechanical level, that is the closest that men's emotions come to having pleasure. Do you remember where I started pointing out that there is really no such thing as emotional pleasures? That is, art sort of serves an interim purpose, always has, between physical pleasure and what little pleasure some men experience intellectual, but it serves sort of an interim purpose the same way that emotions are an interim function between survival instincts and strictly intellectual operations. Art still, if you can see it also, again, you can always bring it back down to survival instincts. Music, you're dealing with the physical sensations. Art, visual sensations, except the sensations that the body is experiencing and the examples that art represents do not seem to be survival necessities. Being able to hear, being able to see under less civilized conditions, under very basic conditions, being able to hear and see would be a prerequisite to survival. But now, under the conditions in which we are now, hearing and seeing are not all that important. You can be visually and orally handicapped, and the government or your family or somebody, they'll send over somebody to read to you. Somebody to lead you around. So art, in a sense, serves a purpose that is not survival required, wherein the sensations of the body can receive some pleasure, and this is moving a little higher up from the instinctive level. It's not quite yet true emotional pleasure, but it is striving for it. But back to what I was saying. If you see it in a certain way, emotions at the individual level, you need to, I'm assuming that you can see that it serves a purpose at the collective level, that men would not be civilized were it not for so-called human emotions. They would not feel guilty. They would not undertake activities to suppress certain of their instinctive levels. They would not successfully suppress to any degree their sexual urges, their hunger urges. They would still be taking food from one another's mouth. So-called human emotions such as sympathy, charity, religious feelings, love for your fellow man, all of that collectively plays a very specific part in civilizing man because they help suppress uncivil or disruptive instinctive passion. So you got to see that so that you get over your argument of emotions or any complaint you have. Then you have to turn on yourself and say, all right, individually, what good does any particular human emotion, or all of them, but anyone, what good has it ever done me individually? None. None. But there's a reason. At the point at which we are now, the emotions have no specific individual use. It's like a function looking for a purpose, for existence. It comes out in art. It comes out, as I said, in imaginary emotions, like all the great poetic rhapsodies in praise of love, charity, religion. That is the general aura around religion at its best, is that it is charitable, It is trying to offer compassion, tolerance, understanding. Its creations look upon man like, oh, you poor things, you're having a hard time, but I'm not unaware of you. But individually, emotions are like, you've got a function ready to go. Or as I used to draw it in the human nervous system, it's like a wire instead of an intellectual hot wire. Emotions are like a wire down in the system that's good and hot. It came out of another main trunk line, but it's like a tributary out of a main river, but it's nice and hot. It's got passion coming through it. It's got energy, but it's kind of flapping around individually now. Collectively, you're all right. But individually, it's sort of flapping around like, what'll I do? I've got this power here. I've got this energy. Where can I aim it? What can I do with it? There is no comparable purpose on the individual level for human emotion. But within the context of man being an unfinished piece of business, here is one of the tricks and one of the secrets for a man to individually undertake his own completion. Because this energy of having so-called human emotions and them having no, as yet, real specific individual purpose. Notice, what is one of the easiest emotions to arouse in people, what ordinary people call emotions? One of the easiest to arouse, and one of the most common is what? I'll answer it, guilt. That is also part of the purpose that religion serves. It stirs up in man a passion, but it stirs up the easiest one possible, guilt. There's only one way a man can feel guilty. Well, collectively, everyone feels guilty because they're unfinished. But individually, the only way you can feel guilty is by not trying to complete yourself. And you can say, well, I feel guilty, but I don't know what to do. Or you can say, well, I sort of know what to do, but I can't seem to get the energy to do it. There is how. That is the secret. That is one of the available tricks. It's one of the saving graces of the position we're in, is you can take emotion on the individual level. Once you see that they have no particular use, the main use that they seem to play in most people's lives is to make you miserable, to upset you. Once you see that they really offer no pleasure, only bittersweet pleasure, which means, well, yeah, I'm happy right now, but I'm going to feel horrible later. You're right. But that's what emotions are, as opposed to passion, as I went through all that. But you can find your own use for the energy, or you can create your own use, whichever one you like. And of course, what I'm inferring is the attempt to be conscious in the moment, the attempt to stabilize your own awareness. And the mind cannot do it alone. You can decide you want to, and you have to hear some description. You have to come up with a mental resolve, an idea of what you're trying to do. But then it's like you never have the energy to do it. You can't say, well, I just keep forgetting. I keep getting distracted, which means the lack of energy. I could try to pick on and make you feel guilty, and so it's lack of effort. And everybody goes, yeah, you're right. But it's not just lack of effort, it's lack of having energy. And you got the energy. Once you realize that emotions individually, so-called human emotions, are serving no specific purpose. It just flaps about in you and it's just running wild. It doesn't have to. We out?